Hi, this is Fran with Stampendous, and we're continuing our fabulous Friday Fun watercolor series. This is lesson 109.
So we're starting in. We've got 3 new clear stamp sets to feature this month. We've got the Fragrant Rose, Hummingbird Hello, and Adventures Await. And that's what we've got for you here today with some fun new ideas. As a brief review, we're using a watercolor brush that's a number 10 round. We've got our favorite color wheel featuring our Daniel Smith set of 6 essential paints. And we're using our palette laid out according to the little diagram. And we're using the Canson watercolor paper, 140-pound cold press. We're going to start with some of our roses and concentrate on what I'll call our minimal style with some pastel colors. I cut some small panels of the watercolor paper, and by taping it onto this grid, it helps me square things off. I'm using some of my regular masking tape, and I'm reducing the tackiness of it by pressing it down on this clean surface. And I just have one last edge to cover here. So generally I'll get things taped, and then I've got the clear stamps on the clear block, and I'm using the versafine black ink. And I've given these time to dry so that we can move ahead to the painting. Practice stamping your messages so that you know exactly how it's going to print on the paper. And if it doesn't come out right, if you stamp that first, you just flip it over and do the other side. So we've got a couple of simple ones lined up here, and I have some samples here to the side. And I want to show you how doing this pastel colors makes it so easy. And this one is so simple, and I really like the soft colors. So we'll get started, and you'll be able to see how I achieved this simple look. So I've got some little strips of watercolor paper for a test strip, and I've got a blotter in hand, and I'm going to carefully lift my palette and spritz to revive all the colors. Make sure you can see that whole area of my palette. Okay. So with a clean brush and some clean water from my well water, and applying some water here into a couple of these compartments that we'll be working with. The Daniel Smith paints will revive with some more water at any time. And the colors are laid out so that I can easily access colors next to the rainbow sequence of how they mix the easiest. And we're going to start with some of this quinacridone rose, or I'll just call it rose. And I've got an area ideal here for mixing that. I want to test it that I don't want it too puddly, but I want a soft pastel on my brush. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so I'm just doing very loose washes, and I want to keep this pastel look going, so I'm going over all of the rose area with that soft pink. And occasionally a little bit of either the scarlet or a little bit of the gamboge color will just add to the interest of my rose so that it's not entirely one flat color. So this is some of the scarlet that I've got in my puddle here. And I can even test putting the two of them together. So for my little bit darker areas, I'm just going to go to this side of the rose, assuming my light's coming from this side. And this will dry a little bit lighter, but if you've got too much of a puddle, you can also lift a little bit of that color with your brush. Okay, so that gave me a little bit peachier color, and I'm just going to let that dry. I wanted to test working on some beige tone paper that's not watercolor, and I just wanted to see if I were doing these light colors, what effect I would get. I can see it soaking in to the paper quite a bit. So we'll try it and see how it compares. I'm guessing the colors won't blend as well, but we'll give that a try. Okay, and while that's drying, I wanted to do this one over again. As you can see, my washes on this one were rather, I don't know, I didn't like it that much. And this one was not taped. So this time I have taped the edges, and I'm going to start with some light blue washes first. And this is my inside or phthalo blue, and it can be a very strong color. I'll put that over here. Okay, and I'm just going to do some washes real loose in and around my flowers. And since I've taped the edges, I might as well come out to the edge. It'll give me a little bit different look. And I want just a very soft wash here across my little message. Sometimes the areas that you don't paint become a part of the interest there. Coming back to this one, I can see a little bit of a hard line. So while it's just damp, I'm able to lift and create a little bit more of a highlight on that side, and lifting away a little bit more of the color in the shadow. And kind of work back and forth if you feel you want a little bit more color. I'll just touch that in. Okay, and then for our soft greens, I really liked the light shade of this, and this green is a little bit more on the olivey side. So in my compartments next to the yellow, I have yellow in 2 more compartments, and then I've added the French ultramarine blue here and the phthalo blue to this pocket. So I can take my damp brush, come up here into this pocket, and mix those 2 colors together. And this is my area for my olive greens. And I can have as light a color with more yellow or a darker olive by adding more of the blue. So I'm going to test it on here, and this is quite a lot deeper color than the other ones in terms of value. So I'm going to very carefully add a little bit more water with my needle tip bottle there. And on this edge I can get the lighter green. Okay, so with this one I painted in just the leaves. On these other ones I did more green in the background. So let's start with some very loose washes that give me this light green across the background. Need to make sure my rose colors have dried before I paint anywhere over them. And I'm keeping it really light. The shape of my brush strokes will be interesting. So I'm just doing some interesting strokes here and there. I think that gives me a nice shape. Almost looks like some grasses. And this is a lot more of a yellow lime sort of green than the colors over here. But once I've done the lighter color, let's see, I'm going to let that dry a little bit, and I'm going to add some of my greens over here. Okay, now I'm going to deepen my olive color just a bit. Okay, and playing off of these shades, this is still a very pleasant shade of green, and these two shades work very nicely together because they're mixed by that same yellow and the green. So now I'm painting a little bit more in and around the lighter colored leaves, and just a little bit more to the background. And I think just that light touch is quite nice. Okay, and then back to this one, let's add some more of these lavender and purpley colors. And to mix that, I'm using rose, and then the rose color is also in these pockets. And I've added the phthalo blue and the French marine blue to the outside over here. So with a wet brush, I can come into that compartment, mix the two together. Adding more rose will give me more of a magenta or a lighter lavender. So let's test that color. Is still quite dark. So we'll add a bit more water. I need to get some of that paint off of my brush since it was that darker color. Now I have more of the lavender I wanted to start with. Since this is light, I'm going to go over some of the blue.
These flowers in the hummingbird set are wisteria, and this flower usually hangs down like a vine, and it may be confusing because it's a lilac color as well. The lilac blossoms are similar, but they usually grow pointing up off of the shrubs, whereas the wisteria are hanging down. So you can use it perhaps either way if needed, and do it in a lilac color or lavender, and then that will work.
You can see when it's that wet and the paper is that damp. Actually, that's starting to spread in an interesting way by itself. I was going to lift some of it away, but maybe I won't. Now I'm going to add a little bit darker to the blossoms that would be underneath. Let's add a bit more green here to our beige paper. This brush, if you use the tip, gives you a finer line. So while those are still drying just a little bit, let me show you how I've taken such a simple little painting and made it into a nice card. And I left this one, there's nice clean cut edges, but I like the torn edge look to look like a decal edge of a watercolor. So I left this last edge to show you how if you can get a hold of it close like this, pull up and do a torn edge like that. Now that this one has dried, I want to add just a little bit more to it here before I move things away. So making sure my brush isn't too wet, that it will hold this darker color. little bit more value. That should be good. And on this one you can see I added just a little bit of more of the yellow tones, and that added some interest. Let's try just a little bit here. So now I think I can safely remove my taped edges. And this one worked okay. It's very pastel. You can compare the different look. And as long as you aren't painting a lot in the background, this other paper will be more forgiving.
When you're sure that your watercolor is dry, then you can safely and carefully remove the tape. And you'll notice that between these two, I created a 1/2 inch space so that I had one strip of tape that did a narrow edge on each of the two that were side by side. Here you can see that a very small and minimal style watercolor still will make a beautiful finished card if you simply add a little bit of trim, some other color papers, or some printed patterns in the background. And if you want to add the beautiful messages that are in the set, the best way to do it that I've found is to take some scraps of watercolor paper that are larger than you need, get a nice flat, soft pastel wash over the whole area and let it completely dry. Then do your stamping in black. Then when that's dry, then do your die cutting. That's the best way to keep a nice even pastel wash that will work very nicely to add your messages. And you could do it in pinks or lavenders or green or any color that complicated the finished look of your card. Now let's take a look at where I've gone from pastel colors to stepping up the color just a little bit, as you can see in the fuchsia and roses that I have here. And if you want to do a nice little bit of color around each of the flowers, the little vignette approach is a nice way to do it. And whether you do the pastel green or a little bit of blue for sky, that works quite nicely. And on this fuchsia over here, if you want a little bit more of a neutral color, let's talk about how we mix our blacks up here in the top part of the palette. And we use the 3 cool colors, the rose, yellow, and French ultramarine. And when those 3 are mixed together, that will give us a neutral gray to black. So if you pre-mix that and then have a little bit of that color, you can lift that and add it in to the area where you mix your olive greens or your blues. And in that way you can tone down the color and get a very soft, more of a grayish green or grayish blue wash, which is quite nice. Now let's take a look at the hummingbird, which is also in the flower set, our little hummingbird hello. I'm going to stamp him in black on my watercolor paper, and then let's try just some leafy greens up in the corner. And for that, we're going to mix our yellow with marine to get an olive shade of green. And instead of a grayed out color, we maybe want a little bit more of the olive color. And then I'm just going to do very simple little dabs of paint. Little brush strokes will give me the illusion of foliage. Then for the hummingbird itself, let's do brighter colors so that it stands out in contrast to the leaves in the background. I'm mixing my purple or magentas and putting that next to the reds, adding blues. We're just going to add all our different colors here for a beautiful array of color on the hummingbird. Here I'm going to stamp the open tree. This is from the Adventure Awaits set, and I've designed it with lots of combination possibilities, and without doing any masking, you should be able to add several of these trees to create an interesting little cluster. And this is just a simple combination that works nicely. Now I'm going to get a soft blue wash to do a little vignette of blue sky behind the trees, and this is the inside, or the phthalo blue. And think little puffy clouds. Paint the blue behind little puffy white shapes that are the negative space, the white of the paper. Then let's add some greens, and again the soft olive greens should work nicely. Mix your yellow with the marine blue. And just create some nice washes that may start out light, and then you can add a little bit more intense color on top. The Adventure Awaits set has quite a few messages in it, and you can combine them in different ways. So if you haven't worked with some sets like this, I'd like to give you a couple of tips about lining them up. I've found a piece of graph paper, and you might print something offline that you can find, and I put it inside a sheet protector so that I could keep it clean. And then take your little message stamps and turn them over. In fact, if they have a bit of ink on them, it may be helpful so that you can see to read the words. And when you turn it over, you should be able to read the message as you put it down on top of the grid paper. Then you can decide how you want to line it up, whether you want to center the two images or whether you want to offset them or put them end to end. You can position them all different ways. So use the grid to line it up, and then simply press your block to it. That's going to lift them in a way that's ready to stamp. And you can see here a couple of different combinations. You might as well test it before you go to your good paper. Here we've stamped the open trees in all the different colors of the rainbow, And on the one I stamped and colored in, and then I did another one just with brush strokes first. Then I couldn't decide if I was going to stamp some more, so if you have some pieces of vellum, you might stamp on that and move it around and decide if you want to add some more of the stamped trees on top. Let's try several different ones here. And then I decided I was ready to stamp on top of my now dry watercolor. This gives you some other ideas of a fun way to make use of these different stamps. I wanted to experiment and try a couple other things, so let's talk through some other options. If you have a Kaleidocolor ink pad, this is one that has a whole range of different greens, and when you remove the lid, you push the colors together, and then you can stamp and create a whole spectrum of light to dark greens. And I stamped that first, and since this is a water-based ink pad, I can take a wet brush to it and just move that stamped color around and create a nice little vignette. Another option is also a water-based Tombow markers. I selected 2 different shades of green, and these markers have a nice big brush tip, and I can apply it directly to my clear stamp. And I did one ahead just to see how it would work. So you can apply 1 or 2 colors directly right onto the stamp, and then working rather quickly, you can then stamp on your watercolor paper and add another wet brush to it or not, but that will give you a nice interesting look as well. Then the next one, I used the Zig Clean Color markers, and these are also a water-based marker, and on the watercolor paper you'll get a nice effect. So I applied the brush marker directly to the stamp, and then added a wet brush afterwards as well. These Zig markers have a brush tip that has different little fibers like bristles to it, and if you want to create some more detail work, you can do that direct to paper or with the stamps. On these other ones, then I went back to the look of using the versafine black ink and then doing watercolor paint into it. So that just saves you some time of some different options if you have some of these other items. Next, I wanted to try using the paints directly on the stamp and see what result I could get. So the first one that I did, I mixed up a pretty intense bit of color of each of the colors and painted it directly onto the stamp. But by the time I turned it over to stamp, of course, it sort of ran, and my first impression was rather blurred. So then I tried it with less water and more intense paint, and again, turning it over altered it a bit. So then I discovered that the best way would be to apply the intense paint onto your stamp and then bring the paper to it. And that did give me the best result of the 3. If you want to add to that now, you can try what I did here of stamping the trees in black. And again, be sure and wait for your paint to dry, and then you can add some other stamped impression as well. So here we have a look at all of these different variations we created with the bright color trees. Thank you for watching this Lesson 109, and be sure and look for me next week where we will continue to take these same 3 sets and do some even more advanced techniques with them in watercolor. Hope you're having fun with it. Bye-bye.